So let's talk about collecting a Space Marine chapter gone rogue, with a few thoughts and ideas for collecting Renegade Space Marines in 40k 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today I thought I'd talk about collecting some Space Marines gone bad, a subject I found kind of interesting as quite a lot of people do collect Space Marines this way in one way or another. It maybe doesn't tend to be the absolute centre of the spotlight from Games Workshop. Lots of the focus taken up by the primary traitor legions against the loyalists, and certainly on the Renegade Imperial sort of side of things, there maybe feels like there's a bit less grey areas than there have been in the past with the Primaris Marines. In any case, for this video though, I thought we'd talk about who are the Space Marine Renegades of Warhammer 40k, and then a few ideas for fielding them. First, starting out with a few of the more standard Renegade Space Marines, well-established warbands that plenty of people might collect already, then a few other ways that you could go about doing an army like that, maybe fielding Primaris but Chaosified, and a couple of other forces that do things a bit differently, with the creations of Bile and the Fallen. First up, and starting with lore, Renegade Space Marines in 40k are generally Space Marines that have turned against the Imperium for all sorts of different reasons, often having a nice backstory that's got the tragic downfall of a chapter, either being lured into or driven into the temptations of chaos for one reason or another. Sometimes it's a mystery, sometimes they've been undone by a fatal flaw, whether it's pride, martial might, or coming to blows with some other arm of the Imperium, and being driven out of the fold, often into the waiting arms of chaos. I feel like people use Space Marine Renegades as a bit of a catch-all term for many formations that just don't really fit within the major legions, in general tending to be warbands that operate on a slightly smaller scale, but also being a bit more free so you can really make your own lore for one if you wanted, or go with one of the ones with some very cool backstories in the lore already. In general, these Renegade chapters might not all necessarily have fallen to the actual corruption of Chaos, though many have or will go on to in the future. I feel like there's a fair few stories out there of chapters just sort of going rogue for one reason or another, sometimes being overzealous in pursuing one goal that they'd been originally set upon, to the point where it clouds their judgment and causes greater harm to their allies, or sometimes a Chaos deity might slowly infiltrate the character of the chapter. Pride and perfectionism could go on to feed Slaanesh, and martial might and bloodlust could be a way for Khorne to gain influence. Many renegades wind up being pirates or brigands, sort of by their very nature, often having to move around a lot to stop the entire might of the Imperium coming crashing down on them, but also to loot and reeve to gain supplies, as well as no doubt the bitterness and satisfaction that they get from inflicting misery on the Imperium. Some bigger formations of renegades might conquer entire worlds, or go around acting as mercenaries that can serve the highest bidder, brutal allies to many a Chaos Lord or desperate isolated Imperial planetary governor. With such varied backstories, there's plenty of options for all sorts of different miniatures to be used in the ranks of a Renegade chapter, maybe using a whole bunch of Loyalist parts, like things from the Tactical Marine sprue, or even some looted Primaris armour perhaps. In general, for chapters maybe more recently turned against the Imperium, there might just be a little bit less of all the spikes and warp touch mutations that some of the more established Chaos Legions might have. I feel like there'd generally be a bit more of a preference for standard Space Marine tech, things like Rhinos and Predators and Vindicators and things, as opposed to big fancy demon engines that a chapter wouldn't exactly have in their arsenal if they've decided to turn traitor. Could be a fun excuse to create maybe a bit more of a dour and practical Space Marine army, perhaps dipping into the Horus Heresy range and use a bunch of their cheap plastics mixed with maybe some more contemporary Chaos Space Marine parts to create something really unique. Looting armour and relic supplies, and basically using whatever they can get their hands on as they raid their way across the galaxy. They haven't really done a massive amount of Renegade Primaris in the lore, but I feel like it's an area that does appeal to people just as a concept, and it certainly could be fun to see their tech in a more done chaos kind of way, even if it might be very unusual in the lore. The options of fielding them with in-game rules are maybe similarly varied. I think most people would generally tend to go for Codex Chaos Space Marines and the detachments within it, particularly Renegade Raiders being a very obvious one. It does seem the detachment most designed with them in mind, though given the different characters that you might have, a bunch of the others could also be really appropriate. Maybe if you wanted to go down a more recently Renegade Loyalist sort of vibe, you could perhaps use core Codex Space Marine rules, maybe one of the standard Loyalist attachments. Just thinking off the top of my head, I can't help but think that the Righteous Crusaders and the Black Templar rules could make some pretty good rules for Chaos Turn Primaris. Having entire 20 strong units worth of maniacs with chainswords could be really nice in a Chaos sort of vibe, and sort of harks back to the 20 strong squads that Chaos Marines could field previously. Otherwise, they do have all the deity codexes as well. If you wanted to go down a purely Khornate path, you could field your Marines as Khorne Berserkers in World Eaters maybe, that might lock out a few other options that some Chaos armies get access to. or do the same with, say, a Nodal-aligned warband playing as Death Guard. First up, focusing on the first option with standard Chaos Space Marine Renegades, maybe going down the most Games Workshop intended path for them and playing Chaos Space Marines right out of the Codex. You could either choose one of the many Renegade warbands from the lore or make your own. For detachment choice in the Codex, Renegade Raiders is aimed at them and is rather great. I'll go through the rules for it briefly in just a second, but definitely isn't the only option. Perhaps the best known of them might be the Red Corsairs. They're an army that was really quite deeply explored by the Forge World Imperial Armour series of books around the Badab War. And it's kind of cool that they've got really quite a lot of wealth of lore to draw on, a bunch of notable conflicts, and they seem to have been rather thriving since. Originally, the Red Corsairs were the Astral Claws chapter, led by Luft Huron, a well-respected chapter master and famed commander across the sector, charged with being a warden of the Maelstrom and preventing pirates and raiders from taking control there. Taking his mission all very seriously, absolutely determined to stabilise it for the Imperium. When calls for an Imperial crusade to overrun the sector and restore order were rejected, he decided to take matters into his own hands, withholding a whole bunch of ties that were due to the rest of the Imperium, and stopping the flow of trade through his sector, using as many resources as possible to increase the strength of the Imperium within his sector, and led a group of Space Marines that sort of soft seceded from the Imperium, dedicated to ruling the Maelstrom in the name of the Emperor, but not working with other Imperials in the sectors nearby. With the Imperial organisation the way it is, it wasn't long before this culminated in a great civil war. The Astral Claws eventually vanquished and fled into the Maelstrom, it being discovered that at some point during their secession, the Astral Claws had fallen to the worship of Chaos Undivided, Luft Huron being renamed Huron Blackheart after being injured, and swore vengeance on the rest of the Imperium. Taking the mantle of the Red Corsairs, they're now a massively powerful raiding threat operating in and around the Maelstrom, generally preying on Imperial planets as much for the suffering that they impart on the planets they once chose to protect from the same threats, ever gaining resources and growing in numbers until some sources report them at a similar size to a pre-heresy legion, and they also boast a whole load of powerful fleet assets, including a Blackstone Fortress and Ark of Omen given to them by Abaddon the Despoiler nonetheless. In terms of sheer power, they might be the single greatest renegade threat to the galaxy. The Red Corsairs are one of the only ones to have their own character as well in Huron Blackheart. Kind of curious that he's gone from the main Warhammer 40k range, so you can't buy him at the moment, but still managed to keep a datasheet in Codex Chaos Space Marines. That perhaps gives me a little bit of hope that at some point they'll get around to actually releasing a new miniature for him. I feel like he's just a bit too much of an iconic character to be removed outright. In game he tends to be a little bit more of a niche pick though, currently 80 points, allows redeploys and has a reactive move style ability. The redeployment thing can be kind of interesting with the Deceptors detachment, where it can give you some pretty optimal mid-board deployment. Besides that, he gets some fairly respectable melee, though a bit behind the regular Chaos Lord with his massive turn of rage mode damage that he can do. He does generally seem to be seen as a bit more of a fun and fluffy type pick though, as opposed to used in any sort of competitive army on the regular. Lore-wise though, there's loads of other renegades out there. The Purger followers of Nurgle, seeing all life as basically corrupt and make war trying to stamp as much of it out as they can. Seem like nice sane people there. The Brazen Beasts are a renegade chapter of unknown origin, making war with mighty waves of cornate demon engines. The Crimson Slaughter took centre stage in 6th and 7th edition, appearing in the Warhammer 40k starter box set for that. They were formerly a chapter known as the Crimson Sabres, driven mad by Khorne when fighting a bunch of cultists, and since then have been pretty much crazed killers, spilling blood for the Blood God. I did think that old Lord Crown on the Relentless was kind of cool. Otherwise, we've got the Scourged, blessed by Tzeentch to hear the falsehoods of the Imperium, being unable to bear the vast hypocrisies that is the Imperium of Man, and the Flawless Hosts, formerly known as the Prideful Shining Blades, now fallen to Slaanesh. These guys previously had rules in previous editions of the Chaos Space Marine rulebook, though in 10th edition Games Workshop tends to operate more by detachments, keeping choices maybe a little bit more simple but perhaps a bit more major and impactful, very different ways to play the same Chaos army. As mentioned, the tailor-made detachment for Chaos Space Marine Renegades are the Renegade Raiders. The rules seems to be a fairly fast-moving and hard-hitting raiding force, having a particular focus on destroying things and taking objectives, and they also just happen to be arguably perhaps the single strongest detachment in Codex Chaos Space Marines currently. At least for general purpose strength, it tends to be this one and the Pact-Bound Zealots, with Chaos Cold having a lot of success at the top end of tournament play with clever board control things. The core rule for the detachment is Raiders and Reavers. Ranged weapons gain the assault keyword, so it can be extra fast to get to objectives and gain line of sight and things. Pretty handy on quite a lot of the army with anything shooty there, particularly things like Vindicators and Havocs might enjoy it quite a bit, as good things like Chaos Predators. Then on top of that you get an AP boost against enemies on objectives, that bit both at range and in melee as well. Really quite a powerful damage boost, given that the opponent's generally going to need to keep on putting units onto objectives to hold the points and get the primaries. It won't trigger all the time, but when it does, it could potentially be really quite big. You could have scary things like AP3 Predator Destructors firing against infantry maybe, or for standard legionaries you could have AP2 Chainswords re-rolling all wounds. Really quite a scary combo of things there. Then on top of that, their stratagems are rather good. They've got an Armour of Contempt equivalent of an Unfailingly Obdurate, always nice for anything in power armour or the 2+ save. Opportunistic Raiders for a chance to fall back from combat at the end of a fight phase. A lot of the time that could be situationally great if it gets a unit to do something that you really needed it to do rather than being locked in combat with an enemy. Warp Charged Engines could give you some speedy transports or bikers. There's an Advance and Charge one, which is really big for getting Chaos Melee where it needs to be, maybe good on things like Chosen or Legionaries perhaps, and for one command point, Ruinous Raid is a big damage buff once a unit gets out of transports. If you have some Chosen in a Rhino, they can potentially get out, and in this detachment have AP -1 better, and also reroll all hits and wounds, which is a pretty massive damage boost between the two. For the enhancements, I feel like they're maybe not quite as impactful as the detachment rule or the stratagems. The Mark of the Hound feels like quite a nice one. Scout 6 inches for the Bearers unit can get something scary going towards the midboard. Not too bad for Chaos Space Marines playing aggressive. Between all that, it's just really quite a lot of general purpose value. Maybe the biggest emphasis being on a bit of fast moving shooting, plus units like Legionaries or Chosen jumping out of transports, and that feels appropriate enough for representing Renegades, I think. A bit of a focus on the rank and file and the gun tanks, as opposed to the slightly more weird and wonderful things out there for Chaos maybe. Obviously that's not the only way that you could represent them though. If your force has fallen to Chaos Worship in a very big way, then maybe the Pact-bound Zealots could be the way to go. I feel like the other detachments have a lot of interest and flavour to them, even if some of them are far less commonly played than others. Things like the Deceptors, Dread Talons, and the Fellhammer Siege Host are pretty rarely seen in any sort of optimised list. Otherwise though, for a very different flavour of fielding Renegades, I feel like one thing that I have seen a few people decide to collect will be to approach the whole Renegade Space Marines thing from the other side, start out with a fairly loyalist chapter, and maybe only have them recently turned against the Imperium, either falling to chaos or just going wild and doing what they want. In general, the core Space Marine range seems to be steadily progressing towards more and more entirely Primaris, which does make that entire lore and theme that's quite well established in the past, as we've seen with those previous Renegade stories, maybe just a little bit more weird feeling for the Primaris Marines, as at the moment in the lore we really don't have all that many examples of them going rogue or joining the Dark Gods. I'm not sure if there's an element of Games Workshop maybe wanting to downplay that kind of element. I guess maybe not wanting to raise the obvious question of where's all the Primaris Chaos Marines if they turn traitor just as easily as the Firstborn did. But nonetheless, given all the past history of Space Marines turning renegades, I think it's a theme that's captured the imaginations of a fair few people. I've certainly seen some people execute a really cool hobby project out of it. In terms of lore though, Games Workshop haven't said that it's impossible for Primaris to fall to chaos, just seemingly extra uncommon. Not that chapters forsaking their vows were a particularly common thing in the first place, but just kind of notable when they did. I don't know if it's maybe a similar sort of idea with the Black Rage for the Blood Angels, where they initially said that the Primaris seemed to be resilient to the Black Rage, but then they were found very much not to be, which I think made sense given it might have undermined the Blood Angels' entire lore a fair bit. In terms of actual traitor Primaris in recent times, there's only really been two big examples that I know of. There was the recent lore in the Arcs of Omen, where Angron destroys the Choral Engine in the Dark Imperium, detonating a great big warp beacon in the name of Khorne. And Khorne smiled down on the sacrifice, sending an entire splinter of an Imperial crusade blood mad, with reports of things like Guardsmen, Sisters of Battle, and Space Marines turning on each other and slaughtering each other, which I think is perhaps one of the closest examples of Primaris going actual full-on tainted by chaos, even if they haven't had any new threats actually arise from the ashes of that, at least not yet. There was also a bit of lore about the Custodes transporting a shipment of Primaris to the Brazen Drakes chapter, only to find that their parent chapter had turned traitor, and then what seemed like a bit of a questionable bit of decision making for supposedly a very intelligent Golden Legion. They decided to basically chalk the Primaris in with their parent chapter in such a way that they struck down one of the Battle Brothers who questioned their logic, the Custodians going on to slaughter the rest of them on their transport ships, at least for that incident, unless there were any survivors. It didn't really seem to fit the bill of the Primaris actually turning renegade, to be honest. It was more just defending themselves when they got lumped in with a bunch of their parent chapter who had turned traitor, even though they'd never met them. In any case though, it certainly feels like a fun idea, and certainly could be a good excuse for some cool conversions. Adding a bunch of mutations, iconography and weapon swaps to some intercessors and friends definitely has to appeal for some. Over the years I've certainly seen a fair bunch of people like to do things with the Alpha Legion and Primaris as well, which could be a fun way to realise an army maybe going in disguise as loyalists, maybe just full on painting them in their standard Alpha Legion style colours, or having some sort of deception type technology like this one. Half in loyalist colours and then a bit of a lightning disguise sort of effect and similar, and then having the other half painted as Alpha Legion and a Chaos Space Marine. This example was shared on Warhammer Community from a kill team by Mark Busing. If going a little bit less high effort though, you could go for a chapter that's maybe lost its way, has cut ties with the Imperium but not necessarily fallen to the machinations of Chaos just yet, perhaps seeing a bit more tattered and battle-worn gear, lots of streaks of blood and things, and just a good excuse for some cool backstory. If going down the sort of Chaos Loyalist point of view, it probably makes more sense to use the actual Loyalist Codex and basically take up one of the detachments that they can choose. Seems like that to be the easier way to do things rather than trying to equip each Loyalist as a Chaos Space Marine and make them work for one of their datasheets. I guess it could be done if you were seriously motivated. As a bit of an aside as well, could be kind of fun to use the Horus Heresy Alpharius Primarch. Maybe use rules for Guilliman or the Lion to represent him, or Abaddon himself if running them as Chaos Space Marines perhaps. There were a couple of people who said they did when I made an Alpha Legion video. Otherwise though, just to touch on another couple of Chaos forces that fall outside the normal Legion control, we've got the Creations of Bile. They had their own rules and things back in 9th edition, basically representing the ragtag bunch of roided out Space Marines used by Fabius Bile, the Spider himself, former Chief Apothecary of the Emperor's Children, but now very much doing his own thing, finding loyalist Space Marines, cutting them up, and ever trying to make the perfect creations. His services often sought out by other Chaos forces, but always with a sense of unease. It's kind of fun that he does have a pretty cool miniature all of his own too. And feels like he maybe could be a bit flexible as to what sort of detachment you filled him with. I guess maybe something like Renegade Raiders or Pact-Bound Zealots feels like one of the better choices. Just something that's going to give the Chaos Space Marines that he leads more punch in melee to represent their big muscles and massive threat. And by themselves can be usable enough, amping up his squad stats and having a few fun regeneration rules that can make him weirdly hard to take down. Finally, and maybe seen by Renegades by some, but very much the true First Legion by others, are the Fallen Dark Angels. They've generally had a fair bit of intrigue and doing occasional meaningful things in the lore. They don't generally tend to take centre stage, and Games Workshop don't really seem to have been supporting them much with their own models or anything, even removing rules for them back in 9th edition and before. It was kind of interesting that with the return of the Lion, they didn't really progress the whole Fallen storyline all that much. They're still out there and randomly turning up, being hunted by the Ravenwing and Deathwing, though a growing number of them gathering around their escaped prophet Luther, presumably for some kind of Dark Angel's final reckoning, brother fighting brother. Dedicated miniatures wise, they only have Cypher, though he does have a pretty fun model. It's genuinely quite a big threat in game at the moment. Loads of plasma pistol shots and bolt pistol shots that you can both attack with at range and then in melee again. Again, I feel like they'd be at least a fairly flexible one at making use of several of the detachments in a nice thematic way. Maybe things like Deceptors or the Veterans one could be good picks to represent the Dark Angels maybe. And in general, if you wanted to represent them on the board, it might make sense to make a good use of perhaps some Heresy era technology, maybe some of the plastic kits and Terminator armour from that era. And you could have a nice fusion with some more contemporary Chaos Space Marine bits, and maybe combined with some Dark Angels iconography themselves, maybe their upgrade sprue, or making use of some of those Inner Circle companions, putting a few more Fallen back in service of the Ruinous Powers maybe. Overall, just a massive amount of ways that you could collect a Renegade Space Marine force. I feel like it's really quite a broad subject, and maybe quite a nice way that you could have a lot of creativity with a Warhammer army, rather than going down one of the more obvious prescribed routes. Loads of choices that you could make, based around a Loyalist or a Chaos force, and then decide how you're going to realise them in game, and if you're going with one of the many Renegade forces in the lore, or you're treading your own path. If you have collected an army in this sort of style, feel free to let us know down in the comments below. It'll be interesting to hear people's takes on them, but I'll leave this video here for now. If you've enjoyed, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help keep them coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.